The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. We are deep in the Great Hunt, approaching the midway point, and we couldn't be more ecstatic that you joined us to digest and pick apart two new chapters of this novel, Chapter 18, To the White Tower, and Chapter 19, Beneath the Dagger. Ooh, what kind of dagger will it be? And I know who can teach us what kind of dagger it is. That is, of course, my co-host. I'm not going to even name myself. I'm just going to name him first. And he is Tylor, our expert on the Wheel of Time.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Greg. I will say you call it halfway through the book. I call it 2 weeks from when I get excited about this book. We are almost there, folks. I'm going to stop complaining soon. I promise. Given that we have a double dose of ill-advised discussion this week, I suggest we get rid of any additional, introductory materials and dive straight into a double ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast. This week, discussing both of the covers for The Great Hunt. So I suggest we begin with the original cover painted by Daryl K. Sweet. It's kind of the classic fantasy image of Rand holding the Horn of Valir over his head with presumably Loyal and Selene near him, and he is surrounded by soldiers in helmets that have horns on them, which annoyingly is how Daryl Sweet decided Trollocs looked when he painted them. What is your thought on the kind of earlier image before we then talk about the interesting decision to redo that image in the ebook series?
Yeah, so I'm looking at it now, and I will say I'm surprised that you said surrounded, because I only seen the one Trolloc, but I'm guessing I'm looking at a cropped image.
So you're probably looking at the front cover as opposed to the wrapped cover.
Okay, so all the way around we get that he's got some more Trollocs about him. Oh, okay, yep, I've seen this here. Yeah, these are these, like you said, these images for that set of covers really just scream classic fantasy. I am not sure who this artist is, but it very much reminds me of the Hildebrandt brothers, who famously did some Lord of the Rings covers and some Star Wars stuff over the years. I don't believe it's them, but it looks a lot like that style where everybody's a little round and a little, jolly compared to maybe how I necessarily picture them. But for being of that genre, I do like the composition of the image, particularly how the light is functioning there. To have Rand casting a shadow and then have, this beacon of light in the kind of center and lots of darkness kind of encroaching along with the Trollocs.
Yeah, and this is exactly how I feel about Daryl Sweet, who drew the paintings for, I think, all of the series except for the final book, because he passed away before it was released. I think he is a really wonderful character artist. I think he gives really good kind of like portraits of kind of classical fantasy characters. My two complaints about Daryl Sweet are, one, sometimes he's not great at painting action scenes. He often just draws characters standing around, and I think this cover is actually the exception to that rule. It's an interesting pose. It works fairly well. My other complaint about Daryl Sweet is that I think he draws really great covers for like classic like sword and sandals fantasy or like Arthurian fantasy. I don't know if he draws great high fantasy covers. I never feel like it's a world of magic in these covers. And that is especially true when he turns Trollocs into people with helmets. So that's a big problem for me in this cover, honestly. That ruins what otherwise I think I agree with you is a well done image that captures the spirit of chapter 19 that we read this week.
Yeah, and looking a little more at Loyal, I will say that is not at all the image I had of Loyal.
Yeah.
He is closer to us, but the fact that he should be taller than the others, like, is striking to me.
Yeah.
He looks of scale with them, not kind of small. And again, with the perspective of him being closer to us, you'd think that would be even more exaggerated.
Yeah, he should be enormous.
Yeah, and his features kind of look more like I would think of a Tolkien elf than I would what we've had described of the Ogier.
Yeah.
And then Selene is just kind of classic damsel on the side of a van fantasy art.
Yep.
In a gown, and a deep cut gown, of course, because of the genre. So yeah, I think, I guess the last thing I would say is the colors as well. It's just not the colors I've been thinking of. Even if those match the descriptions, I think I don't. It's like when you watch a medieval movie from the 60s and all of the knights and royals are wearing really vibrant, bright colors, versus now when we see a medieval film and everybody's dirty because everybody would be dirty in medieval times. So those things stand out too.
Yeah, I think the one kind of anachronistic detail in this that always struck me is you mentioned the lighting being really interesting and well done. I 100% agree with you. This is a scene that takes place at 2 a.m. It's a little weird that there's that much light. Other than that, I think then the interesting thing to dive into is the fact that for the one and only time in the series, when Tor decided to redo the covers upon the release of the ebooks, they chose this book to be a recreation of the original cover rather than a truly original image. And so this leads us to the second cover. If you're looking for this online, if you Google ebook cover Great Hunt, that should give you what you're looking for. The cover
of course, you mean check our social media and
that also
double check that Greg has posted these. But that is my intention, that when we drop this episode, you can go right to our social media. Plug. But go ahead.
This art is by Kakai Kataki. Apologies for any pronunciation errors. And I actually love this image. It takes what was once the forefront of the image and pushes it into the background, and it takes the piece of the previous art that I hated so much and emphasizes the Trollocs in the image. I think it works all around. What are your thoughts on this?
The two together remind me of the meme, which I don't even know Always Sunny that well, but the meme where the two characters are seeing each other across the fancy party.
Yeah.
It very much looks like that meme where it's like you said, they just flipped it, and it totally works. And certainly gives a more ominous feel to it. The lighting, you might be skeptical that it's 2 a.m., but it is at least darker and kind of more apiece to the dark tone to the moments we've seen this in. And certainly this is one of those moments that is a bit of hope, but surrounded by darkness and creeping disorder.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, Loyal actually looks like a hulking creature as opposed to someone who is like 5'11", which I appreciate. And I also think, given the way that she is presented, at least so far in the story, I prefer this presentation of Selene to the previous one, rather than being, like you say, obviously kind of the classic damsel in distress character. Keeping her very small and shrouded and not clear in the image, I think, is a much better way of representing that character, who at least both of us feel like we haven't gotten a really great read on so far. So I appreciate both of those characters' presentations in this as opposed to the original image.
Yes, I can. In the version I was looking at, I can barely see Selene, so I've been Googling or clicking around for a better one, and it's not loading. So I
There is
can't
not a better
necessarily
one.
react.
It is very small and very dark, and that's what I appreciate about it.
All right, fair enough. Very cool. And I did get an uncropped version when I was clicking around, and I will say I dig the Trolloc sword. It's
Oh yeah.
it's definitely a monster sword, not just something they picked up, which is very cool.
Yeah, and I think one thing I do really appreciate about this image is we get like 3 or 4 Trollocs in it, and they all look extremely different, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about the description, and something that is often not translated into a lot of the art we see, where you kind of see one type of Trolloc represented. It's really great to see like wolves and ram horns and something that looks kind of like almost avian. That's what I want out of my Trollocs.
Well, and we get a I noted a kind of avian version of a Trolloc in the chapter. So that,
Yeah.
Again, I don't mean to make fun of the first artist, but it is like, oh, this person read the book, right?
Right,
Like,
right.
and, usually when those arrangements happen, there's a lot of famous Star Wars posters like this where they were handed a few pieces of
Yeah.
concept art or were shown them in an office and then had to remember what to draw later. So I think the first one kind of gets off the hook in that way, but this one feels closer. It feels like an improvement, which is what you would want if it's a modern take on it.
Yeah, there are very few of the new covers that I don't prefer to the originals. And it's exactly because of what you describe. I think it's because they are, made by people who have had decades to think about and decide what the key moments are, as opposed to someone who has to print it from an early draft and doesn't exactly know what, the reaction is going to be. I don't really have too much else to say about these images other than I deeply love them both and the new one is better. Any last thoughts you have?
I mean, they always just make me feel inadequate using my mass market paperback, just a kind of white with a faded symbol on them covers. But, there's some elegance in mine as well. And I've noted, this is not specific to Wheel of Time, but I've noted in recent years how often companies are making a lot of money doing like new leather bound editions, and like right now there's a beautiful illustrated version of Harry Potter being created and so on. So it'll be interesting to see again. I think those have kind of replaced the movie tie-in editions, quote unquote. Right, like when the Lord of the Rings books came out, they released those with pictures from each of the films every time. So like a new version of Fellowship with a picture of Return of the King on it when Return of the King came out.
Right.
And so I don't see that as much anymore across a fantasy series. I don't think I ever saw a Game of Thrones book with Amelia Clark on the cover that I can think of. But some handsome leather bound or something like that would certainly fit the job.
Yeah, I saw a copy of The Eye of the World that had like a very far off image of Moraine from the show, but that is the only thing I have seen. And obviously they don't have anything to do for anything after book 1. So I can't confirm that. I can confirm there is an absolutely gorgeous dust jacket Kickstarter that someone did that you can get a dragon across all 15 of your books that I almost paid a lot of money for.
Well, I think then we should let you take us into these chapters and dive right in. We don't have. Well, I'm curious to see how long our conversation is tonight, if I'm being honest, because these felt like chapters where maybe I was only sensing the tip of the iceberg. So would you please summarize for us chapter 18, To the White Tower?
Absolutely. We begin with Egwene on the deck of the River Queen, the lead of the ships that are taking the Aes Sedai back to Tar Valon, and she notes that the wind has been strong at their back the entire time that they have been on the river, likely due to some sort of Aes Sedai powers. Nynaeve is seasick, and she is not happy about it, but Egwene says that at least they should be arriving that day. Nynaeve then asks if, Egwene is still having bad dreams, whether she's still worried about Rand. And this is when Egwene tells us not only has she been having worrying dreams about Rand falling into some sort of trap, and she's worried that he's been channeling, but she also says that she has been dreaming about a man in a mask who we quickly come to realize is Baal-Zaman in her dreams, in the same way that he seemingly was in the boys' dreams in the previous book. At this point, the Merlin arrives and says that she is going to be giving them their lesson for for the day. And she basically immediately begins by bullying Nynaeve repeatedly. When Nynaeve says she would like to learn how to use a sword, she summons a sword out of the air. When Nynaeve says she would like to learn something useful, the Amyrlin ties her up in weaves of air. And at this point, it turns out that Nynaeve is quite good at copying things, even if she can't always do things consciously. And she also wraps the Amyrlin up. The Amyrlin says, I am going to let you go if you let me go. Nynaeve says no, and the Amyrlin cuts her off from the true source. This was something she wasn't aware could happen, and immediately after she is restored, Nynaeve seems to be at least quite a bit more willing to go along with what the Amyrlin asks. We then cut to a scene after their training in which it becomes apparent that the Amyrlin did not go easy on Nynaeve. It did not go well for her, and Nynaeve essentially forces Egwene to promise that no one will ever hear about this. She's clearly not in a great place. At this point, they arrive in Tar Valon. They go up on the top. They see the beautiful bridge and all of the buildings. And as soon as they arrive, the Amyrlin and all of the other Aes Sedai leave and seemingly ignore them. So the girls have to get off the ship on their own. They have to arrange for the horses, although apparently that has been taken care of. And they begin making their way through the city until they are met by an Aes Sedai by the name of Sheriam, who introduces herself as the mistress of novices. When Nynaeve says that she is not going to be a novice, Sheriam says both that the next level up from novices that is accepted can still be sent to the mistress of novices for punishment. And then she says, don't expect that it's always going to be as bad on you as the Amyrlin did. That's only for the first few weeks that you are an accepted. Nynaeve is shocked, and the chapter ends. And honestly, I'm okay with any chapter that ends with Nynaeve shocked that she is going to be punished for things. So what's your thought about this chapter, where I think we get a lot going on, but at the same time, it's literally maybe like 4 or 5 hours of not a whole lot of plot development? Do you take this as a lot happens chapter or a not a lot happens chapter?
I would lean towards not a lot happens. I think we are getting mostly indicators that what we observed the last time we were with these characters is all happening.
Yeah.
So let me throw it back to you with 2 specific thoughts. First is, one of the things that stood out to me was that this feels like it should be a Nynaeve chapter, and it's an Egwene chapter. Wonder why, right? Like,
Yeah.
why is it exactly that Robert Jordan would put us in Egwene's head? And one of the things that came to mind is the fact that Nynaeve feels very out of control, and
Yeah.
particularly across the chapter. But since we've separated the group and whatever has been happening between her and Lan, we just haven't been in Nynaeve's head, and it just feels like she's going more and more out of control. And I'm not saying that the character is out of character. It just feels like she's moving in a specific direction, and I don't have a handle on why. So that was kind of my lead thought. And then the second one to pick up on, we talked last Egwene chapter about how it seemed like more than anything, they all wanted to separate these two. And boy, do we just get ultimate confirmation on that. It's like they're going to be separated pretty much in every way. But particularly, let's get Egwene to not look up to Nynaeve anymore. Felt like the goal of the Amyrlin's lesson. So make what you will of either of those while I mute and cough.
Absolutely. So your first question, why isn't this a Nynaeve chapter? I have kind of 2 suspects, and I'm not sure which of them is the better one to follow. So one answer I have here is that Robert Jordan really seems to like, in some cases, setting up mysteries and then keeping you out of the heads of people who know the answers to those mysteries, right? Sometimes I think he's very deliberate about not whose head are you in, but whose head are you not in. And I think there are a lot of things that being in Nynaeve's head would resolve for us that he doesn't want resolved yet. You gave the example of what's going on between her and land, but there's also what's going on between her and Moraine, and what is her exact feeling towards the Merlin, because it's got to be relatively complex, even though there's a lot of hatred in there. I think some of it is that it's Robert Jordan wanting to keep us in the dark. I think the other potential part here actually ties into your second question. I think part of what is happening here is this is a chapter about challenges Nynaeve goes through, but it's just as much a chapter about how Egwene responds to suddenly being put above Nynaeve. And so I think that is potentially why we're in her head, is Robert Jordan is less interested in what is it like to be the, problematic student, or at least be treated as the problematic student. He's much more interested in what is it like to be the best friend of that person while also getting praise heaped on you, which I kind of agree is the interesting story, even though you're right, this could very easily have been a Nynaeve chapter and it just would have been a completely different story.
Well, and to that point, I think about this kind of old adage that one of the first signs that you're growing up is the fact you recognize that your parents are flawed people. And this isn't exactly a parent relationship, but it is that kind of relationship. And I think Egwene is just learning that hard truth of, oh, this person I thought was perfect or always in control or could save me from anything is just a person. And I think, that is an important thing for all these characters. There are times when each of them calls out to somebody else they thought was perfect. So I think it's important that we get that strand here. Well, I'll jump back to the beginning of the chapter and say across this whole chapter, I was impressed by how much the power set of the Aes Sedai grew. From the beginning of, they're moving the current and the wind and manipulating a lot. And while I recognize this is a big group of them together, it's like, there's a lot of power here.
Yeah. And I think that actually ties into exactly what I assumed you were trying to get us away from. You're like, let's talk about the wind and the river. And I'm like, no. Let's talk about the dreams, Greg, the dreams. I think that this chapter does a really good job of establishing that there are a lot of different things that can be done by Aes Sedai, but also at the same time establishing limits and restrictions to what they're doing. You talk about the wind and the river, but I think it was at the early part of the book we learned that they had actually flooded some villages inadvertently trying to get up the river as quickly as they did. And now we're learning things about, for example, the Merlin says that she is able to lift Nynaeve, but it is impossible to lift yourself and use that trick to create flying. And so I think layering on top of what you're saying, kind of limitations in terms of what is known in terms of Egwene's dreaming or what can be done in terms of flying, putting that on top of, as you say, greatly expanding the limits works really well. It kind of serves to both raise the ceiling and establish something of a floor, which is really helpful just to kind of get a grasp on what the White Tower is going to be before we arrive there. What is your take either on Egwene's dreams or just generally the way that we kind of keep getting messages about what the Aes Sedai do and how they do things without actually getting any kind of explicit details?
Yeah, so in my notes next to the part about her dreaming, I said it feels like a promotion, and stuck in my mind was the fact you had shared with me that she, as a character on the show, kind of got promoted to be one alongside the boys, and I felt like this felt like almost a little bit of retconning, like, oh yeah, she's that important too, and
especially with Beelzebub.
Yeah, exactly. And so it very much felt like that. The fact that again we get that she's hiding that from the Aes Sedai, it's the classic book thing of like if they had one conversation it would all be over. But I liked that, and it does feel like the Aes Sedai are taking it seriously, that she probably has this foresight, that this power to I'm losing the word, forecast, to see, foretell, that she has the power to foretell, and this will be a part of her powers when she gets there. And it all feels a little like freshman year. Like, you can major in all these things. And because we're at the center of Aes Sedai power, we're seeing representatives of all the colors plus the different powers that some of the different colors would choose. And it seems to be those don't exactly line up, right? It just because you're green, you don't have these 3 powers. It's not like a video game skill tree in some sense. But all that works. And, I think I was just listening to a really good podcast that was a review of the film Cocaine Bear. And their complaint was that, you can have a premise as silly as you want, but it has to follow rules inside of it. And that's exactly what comes to mind here. It's reminding us, while, as you said, they're not going to reveal all the rules yet, there is a logic and there is a limit, and that just makes it all feel more believable, and that we can eventually get those answers, not that they're being made up as they go along.
And I will say, as a repeat reader, this is something that I think Robert Jordan does really, really well in these scenes. Is there is kind of a logic and a rhyme to a lot of things that are happening that isn't apparent on the first read, but I think pays off really well the second time you read it. And it's like, okay, this was phrased that way because of this, and these are things that needed to be there because of that. And I don't want to really reveal too many of those, but there are lots of little pieces in here that they seem kind of like cryptic and interesting the first time around, and the second they finally piece together, little bits of the puzzle. I think it's really well done, and it's something Jordan does very well. I think he designs 800 world building details and then gives you 20 of them, but they are internally consistent because everything works around them. And that's something that I think the masters do, that sometimes, like, pretty good fantasy stories, they work, I enjoy them, but they don't hold together like that upon close inspection.
And in that, I think even as a fresh reader, I'm getting that sense. And again, that's obviously shaped by the reputation of these books and him as a writer. So he has the benefit of that. But I think you're right that, when I'm going to be a little rude, when you read like YA fantasy or kind of bad YA fantasy, it feels a little slapdash, and there's often like a power that it comes into the third act, and you're like, oh, that exists here, and we just need it. It's power of convenience, if nothing else. Well, and so to continue that conversation, when the Amyrlin has her lesson, I think we get revealed a lot of new powers. I was thinking a lot about what this would look like on the television show. And has the television show gone past here? Have we caught up?
Not really. The TV show is almost exclusively the first season, but like grabs a little bit of stuff we have already read from book 2 to do some scenes.
Well, the comp that kind of came to mind was mostly the first Doctor Strange movie, and the way they conjure and kind of move their hands. And that kind of their powers are kind of light, but there are some ways in which they look like the shaping of air or conjuring a sword in that same regard. So that's kind of what came to mind. But the air and the bands, those are powerful.
Yeah, it reminded me actually of, I don't know whether you've read the Magician's trilogy by Lev Grossman, but in those books, learning to do magic is almost as much about like forcing your fingers to move in ways they don't want to, because the movements are so precise. And that's kind of what that makes me think of, right? It's just delicate, and it seems like they're manipulating really fine things, and they just need to know what tiny thing to grab to make it work. I think in both ways, I think we're getting at the same metaphor, but that idea of just the difficulty of grasping it, I think is really well highlighted here. But then, as you say, also what you can do with it when you do grasp it, the immense power that's, kind of available. And so to me, I read this scene as being the two sides of Nynaeve, right? We see Nynaeve at her lowest and her most difficult struggle. She's unable to grasp the power in many cases. She seems to only be able to do it when she's really angry. But we also see Nynaeve at her best. She learns how to snatch up the Amyrlin with seemingly no trouble at all, having only seen Air be able to do that once before. So I think this to me is a really interesting scene, both as we're saying in terms of the dynamics of what can Aes Sedai do, but also figuring out where Nynaeve fits in that as seemingly both extremely powerful and extremely limited relative to even Egwene, who should be at around the same level.
Yeah, and the tone here made me think a lot about Anakin from the Star Wars prequels. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Tyler. There's the original trilogy, and then they made 3 movies in the 90s. You saw them, but you've blacked out those experiences.
That is correct, yes.
But the theme around Anakin in those movies that maybe don't exist to you, is that he's too old to be trained, and it felt like Nynaeve is there. And the point in the Star Wars mythology is that when you're old, you already have your attachments and you're too kind of volatile and kind of broken already to successfully train. And so it feels to me like that's what we're seeing in Nynaeve, somebody who's this old and, everything that comes with age, ego, actual life and concerns and complications. All of that gets in the way. And so while she could be immensely powerful, it's a really dangerous kind of powerful, which was my key takeaway from that lesson.
Yeah, this actually reminds me of going to grad school in economics, which is a really weird experience because going to grad school in econ, like half of the people are economists from undergrad, and then the other half are just people who are really good at math and want to make some money. And so there's this weird thing that happens where like the engineers are struggling with the econ at the same time that the econ undergrads are struggling with the math and trying to figure out where do you fit in that and what pieces together for what and what do you're kind of forced out of your comfort zone. That's what I feel like Nynaeve is doing here, right? You either come in with like an engineer's brain and you need to break down, no, these involve real humans that can make mistakes, it's not an equation, or you kind of come in with no math and you're like, please teach me equations. And either way, you kind of feel like Nynaeve here. It's overwhelming and you will make great strides simultaneously.
Yes, and I'm additionally laughing because I just had a student turn in a sample bibliography for our research paper where they're interested in looking at what's causing inflation right now. And they clearly went with the first 8 papers in the database that came up when they searched inflation and think they're going to read econ articles with no engineering and no econ. I'm like, you have no shot. Like, I have no shot. I'm not making fun of the student. I have no shot at these articles, and you are a first-year student. So I said to her, I'm like, are you sure these look like tough reads? So mangling your very good analogy, but I think that feels right here that like we see both of our characters here. They're going to struggle in very different ways. But more than anything, the shame that Nynaeve leaves that lesson feeling that, shame is one of the most powerful emotions, right? Like it's going to take a long time for her to want to look Egwene in the eyes again. And I think that more than anything, it actually more than the literal like class level separation, that's going to do the most damage to this relationship.
Well, and then I think just the salt in the wound of 5 pages later, we find out that the Emerlin has already told enough people that the Mistress of Novices knows about it, even though they are aware they have not directly communicated because they saw the Emerlin leave without talking to Sheriam. So I think that is just, I think the Emerlin knows exactly what she is doing there and is making sure it's not just Egwene who knows about this, it's everyone who knows about it. And I think you brought this up, you mentioned this earlier when you were talking about why are they trying to separate them and how effectively is the Emerlin doing it. I think this is the icing on the cake for that separation plan. And it's very well done, even if it's a real jerk move.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a small town, and so like all of this just rings true to that small community life. This isn't a town necessarily; it's a coven almost, but but it's like when you embarrass yourself at the town cafe, it's like, well, I just don't go to cafes anymore. Like I'm done there. So it felt very much like that. I will say my notes get more sparse when we arrive at Tar Valon. That's not from lack of interest. I thought it was really good description. It laid out the city well. I like the balance of having the White Tower but Dragon Mount in the background. Again, I was like, this must look beautiful when we get there in the show, and
It
very
does.
cinematic. Yeah. And then as we learn a lot about them walking around the city, it seemed to me the key takeaway here is that this is much more ornate than any city we've experienced thus far.
Yeah.
I thought back not to Camelin, but to the first city that was all like logs, and how
Barrelon, probably.
Barrelon.
Yeah.
It was all like log palisades and such. And it's like, oh, we are in a totally different world, even though geographically we're not actually all that far compared to the whole stretch of the continent. So those are kind of my initial thoughts on seeing Tar Valon.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard once or twice, I think Loyal has mentioned that Tar Valon is one of the kind of like great cities that the Ogier built. And so it would make sense that we're getting all of this like beautiful ornate description. The only other note that I had beyond that, because I literally just have a little star and then next to it is the word city. So I think we've accomplished that. The only last thought I had is we get a lot of hints in this chapter and then the previous one from Egwene's POV about kind of the difficulties and challenges of being a novice in the White Tower. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about where you think their story is going as they're now kind of arriving at whatever Wheel of Time Hogwarts is. Do you have a read on what direction you think they're going, or are you kind of just anticipating they're going to learn some stuff and we'll see what happens?
Well, I definitely went for Patrick Rothfuss, not J.K. Rowling, but similar in spirit. And I would say my kind of assumption is just that they are here for a while. I don't know if a while means the rest of the book or multiple books, but it feels to me that, this is not like a brief stopping point on something and it won't be interrupted. Especially just the scale of the city and the Dragon Mount. It feels like this is where the end comes. Like that's, and I'm saying that because that's where the end came last time the wheel spun, and thereby the beginning of this time. So
you're saying the beginning's going to be at the end, just like the end was at the beginning, because that sounds very much like time is a wheel.
Yes. I told you before we started recording, I was at the movie theater today, and there was a poster for the 10th Fast and Furious movie. And the tagline for that movie is apparently "The end of the road begins here," which has to be the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. I'm like, so really what you're telling me is Fast 11 or Fast 12 is the last movie, but you need to make this one feel important. So Correct. You're going to So I don't know the exact plans for that franchise, but I was like, oof, that's rough. Like just write the word family, just Fast 10, family again. Done. So much better. But so yes, I believe the end of the road begins here for these characters.
And that is as good of a transition as we are going to get into chapter 19, Beneath the Dagger. So this chapter begins, Rand is cold in the mountains. He is once again saying he is going to leave as soon as the day is done because the Dark Friends clearly aren't coming, but he knows that he is not going to leave because Selene will talk him out of it. At this point, he wakes up, rolls over, and suddenly he sees Selene is about to go through his saddlebags. He asks her what she is doing. She seems startled that he is awake, and then she does the most Selene thing ever, says, "Oh, it's no problem. I was just going to take my top off. I need to borrow one of your shirts." Rand responds just like he's 18 and forgets anything that came before that. He gets her a shirt. He is shocked when she starts changing, and then he turns around. Hurin then arrives and also acts like he's 18, but informs Rand that there is a fire in the distance. It is possible it's the Dark Friends. At first, Rand says he just wants to follow after and get Agelmar, but Selene gives him the glory speech, and he decides he is going to check. So him and Loyal end up going the couple of miles to the Dark Friends camp. When they arrive, they realize that all of the Trollocs are sleeping, as is Padden Fane, and they immediately see the chest that contains the horn of Valir with the ruby dagger on top of it. Initially, they are almost caught by a Trolloc, but it falls asleep immediately somehow. And then they sneak their way through the camp. They grab the dagger. Loyal grabs the chest. They make their way out of camp. Shortly after they get out of the camp, they hear Padden Fane start screaming, and they immediately make their way back. They check that the horn is in the chest, and somehow Selene knows how to open it. It is the horn. Selene is very impressed, and Rand kind of initially says he is going to take it back to Agelmar, but Selene says, no, the Dark Friends are going to be hunting us. We need to go on to Carrion, and Rand seems convinced by this. Eventually, he realizes that he needs to not be carrying the dagger around, and so he deposits it in the chest along with the horn and seals it up. We then get a Fane POV in which he yells at some Trollocs, knows where Rand is, and says that he is a dog no longer, which I don't understand, but I'm going to see if you did. That is the end of the chapter as far as I see it. This, I think, is an a lot happens chapter. And so I suspect slightly less talking, as we always say. What was your take on a lot happening?
Yeah, there is certainly a lot here. And I think most of my thoughts were spent thinking about Selene and the way she was manipulating Rand. And that is just start to finish. Even when he's away from her, he's thinking about her. And we talked last episode about this promotion she's had to like the level of Egwene, and that's where his thoughts are all the time. But most of all, I was thinking, are your thoughts really there? Are you just a horny 18-year-old, or are you, being manipulated in some way? Is there a power there? I'm still months ago I mentioned I was addicted to Marvel Snap, and that has only deepened. And so one of my favorite cards is Enchantress. So as we think about Selene, I've been thinking a lot about Enchantress as that kind of spell weaving character that is manipulating Rand. So and then a stupid thing to talk about, being a nerdy man and, dare I say, maybe woke. I am not involved in locker room talk, for a pejorative term, much. But I remember once at my old job, I was sitting with two other guys a little older than me. And the closest maybe I've ever been to locker room talk is one of my friends saying, like, you know how when you watch movies from the 50s, the beautiful woman always slips into the man's dress shirt after she climbs out of bed after they've made love? I always wanted a girl to do that for me, and they never do. And if you really think about it, it is a strange, like, is it the shirt that he took off then that she's wearing? Does he just have dress shirts around? I prefer to think she goes into his closet and gets like the neatly pressed shirt. And as they joke about here, it's always in Hollywood movies just exactly the right length, so you get just enough of a suggestion without anything that the MPAA would object to. So in the very awkward opening scene, that conversation was on my mind of like, has any girl ever actually done that?
So my notes were all very similar. I referred to this as the oldest trick in the book repeatedly. I think there is one moment, though, that actually ties together two of your observations. You were talking about whether Rand is either just kind of being 18 or being manipulated in some way. And you also talked about how the shirt was just kind of the perfect length. Well, at one point, Rand sees Selene in the shirt, goes to get his horse, comes back, and remarks how the shirt looks much smaller than it did just a moment ago. So that could very well be 18, but that definitely feels like at least a hint from Robert Jordan that something might be going on here that isn't quite the norm. Something odd is afoot. You mentioned kind of Enchantress. I've been playing Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, which is a wonderful action RPG if you're into that thing. But that game is all about demons and devils, so I immediately jumped to Succubi. I was like, okay, this feels just a little too perfect for it to be anything other than a massively planned seduction. We talked about this last time, but I think this is why I struggle with all of the Selene stuff, is because Rand is just a little too naive for my taste here.
Yeah, and all of that, and then what do we get but just vamping in the speech of glory, and it's like, yes, I am beautiful, I could be yours, but I want you to have your glory. And that manipulation just felt so broad. It's like, yep, this, we know exactly what she's doing, and drawing on him. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, like, we don't see that side of Rand. Rand doesn't see glory except around here. And it was even like he really felt that way during the speech, but as he gets a little further away, it kind of lessens, the effects lessen on him, and he thinks much more about his connection to his friends, which has traditionally been Rand's motivation.
Yeah, so this was actually a question that I had for you. It seems like Selene kind of is playing exactly the same tune over and over again, right? It's glory, 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 glory. That's the wrong way. So that's the wrong way to win Rand over. It's just, it's not how he works. And so I'm left kind of wondering, is this Selene playing by the wrong playbook for some reason, or is it Selene telling Rand what she wants rather than what he wants? And I think both of those are potentially up there, but I think when we initially see this, we assume Selene is offering Rand what he wants, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I do, the way you formulated that, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? This can be her one play that she always plays, kind of a femme fatale in a noir or something like that. But also could be misreading Rand. Again, we haven't learned a lot about other potential history versions of the dragon and so on in this particular regard. But to think that maybe what makes this Rand different is that he is connected to his friends and to his people. And I guess tonight is a Star Wars night. I immediately go to the Emperor and Luke, and Luke says, your overconfidence is your weakness, and the Emperor responds, your faith in your friends is yours. And that's also kind of a Harry Potter thing, where the evil doesn't understand connection, because the evil has never embraced that or felt that genuine connection, right? I think that's actually more of a Harry Potter movies thing than books, but I pity you because you'll never know love. It is that kind of breaking point between Harry and Voldemort, and it kind of feels like that. Like, to her, connection can only be to advance your aims, right? No love, just sex for power, essentially.
And I think that this is really interesting.
Sorry, that's your business card, isn't it?
Yes, that is correct. That's my tagline. Fast 10 can't top me. I think that as you're saying this, you're exactly right. She's playing the wrong card, but it works, right? Because in the next scene, as we see Rand, going through the darkness, trying to find the dark friends, immediately what he does when he gets nervous is exactly what Selene tells him as she leaves camp. He should be in the void and the flame at all times. He is what she calls the oneness. He maintains it more or less from the beginning to the end of his trip with Loyal. And at one point, Loyal even comments on it as his voice sounding odd when he is in the oneness. So I'm curious whether you think that is what Selene is after, because we clearly see some odd effects of that potentially later on in the chapter, or do you think this is just, something she thinks if he is in the oneness, maybe he's easier to manipulate or might be more obsessed with glory, something like that? Do you have a thought on what him being in the flame and void is either to her or to himself?
To me, the oneness is giving into your anger. It's the dark side, and that is what she wants. And if that, I think that's less about a specific goal she has, and just kind of softening him up to go join Baal-Zaman, is kind of how I know there's a lot of guesses in what I just said, even though I stated it like facts. But it seems to me that that's her goal, is to make him easy pickings for the actual Baal-Zaman. And so by getting him to live more and more in the oneness and feel that side of himself, I think that only makes it easy to then kind of slip into the full evil instead of having to, really transgress to get there.
Yeah, and I think that that actually ties in with the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is that when Rand initially enters what Selene is now calling the oneness, the first thing he does is he thinks of his father. He thinks of the training that he's had, and then he starts kind of sneaking through the darkness, remembering all of the like hunting training and things that he's gotten from Tam. And then it seems like as soon as he stops thinking of Tam, that's when it seems like Sidene starts creeping in. So I thought that was really interesting to see the contrast between the way that Selene is thinking of the oneness versus the way that Tam taught Rand about it. And then obviously this new third intruder upon that duality is the fact that, you know, the access to the power and the madness that comes with it is tied up in that dichotomy. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the presentation of the Flame and Void kind of more generally, and then also that fact that it ties to Tam as much as it does to any of these kind of new powers that are floating around in Rand's head.
Yeah, it is easy to forget that that is where we first met the Flame and the Void, right? And I mean, that must go back to like chapters 2 and 3. Like, it's so early in the first book, and so you know where my mind goes with all of that. I would fold in the fact that Selene addresses Loyal in like a very old name, the kind of high ornate language.
Yeah, Alantin.
Altine.
Yeah,
A
and we
lantern.
and we learn in this chapter that that means brother to the trees, and it's a reference to tree singing.
And he says, you know, this is like basically like I haven't heard that in a long time. Like it's old tongue reference. And so all of that makes me think that this comes from the old blood of the three of the two rivers. Sorry, Three Rivers is a casino in our area, but Two Rivers is the region in the book. And so that felt like, oh, you know, there is something deep in there. And the last thing I'll fold into that is it was really striking to me that when after the theft happens and Padan Fane is so angry, he screams out for Al Thor. And I really bumped on that everybody else seems to be denying. Other than Lan nicely respected the adopted father as just father as it should be, but everybody else has been like, yeah, that doesn't really count, dude, you're from somewhere else and that matters more. But here we have, you know, one of the most evil characters we've encountered saying like, no, what matters is that he's Al Thor. He's you know, of that line there. So I think all of that makes me think there's something connecting that all to the old blood of that region, and that's going to be a key point. I mean, I think we've seen so many references to the Flame and the Void, and I feel like it's so easy to dismiss all that as just trying to make visual something that's really kind of bizarre, right? Like trying to describe something that you could see, but it does feel like it's becoming more and more of a key to unlocking exactly who Rand is going to be.
Yeah, and I think that the moment to me that stands out in this chapter is once they have shockingly easily gotten into and out of the camp, when the Trollocs start kind of attacking and Rand has to fight them. First he battles one and then another, and then he battles two, and then he fights four of them at the same time. And as he is doing this, his internal monologue is first kind of increasingly fighting the urge to grasp onto Sidene and burn them all. And then eventually he kind of reaches a point where it seems like he is kind of fighting just because it's the only thing he can think to do other than grab onto the power. And so this is kind of a new threat that is emerging within the Flame and the Void, on top of all of, you know, kind of the history and tradition and everything else around it. What did you make of this? You know, Rand repeatedly refers to it as madness, and at one point he refers to it in his own head as madness and says it sounds like another man's thoughts. This seems like a lot of kind of new things happening all at once. What was your take on this kind of odd behavior by Rand?
I went back to at the end of the last book, it really felt like Rand had undergone some kind of let's just say metamorphosis, right? He'd become something new and we'd be losing our Rand. And that has seemingly been backpedaled on so far this book, right?
Yeah.
We haven't seen that new version of Rand. I want to just call it the Dragon Reborn version of Rand, but I don't want to take liberties.
Yeah.
But that new version of Rand that came out of that fight at the end of the first book felt like we were getting these hints that he's totally new. But whatever that was, he's not that guy seemingly yet. And the more layers we add to that, the more muddled he seems to be. And maybe it's the muddling that's preventing him from getting there. So, in these particular moments, there's Rand, there's his old Two Rivers blood, there's the fact that he is the Dragon Reborn, there's the fact that Selene is manipulating him. Well, Moraine's manipulating him too, but Selene in this moment is manipulating him to be kind of dark sidey. And so I think I am just seeing, layer on layer on layer in this onion and not understanding who Rand is. And while I think there's a danger that's just my confusion as a reader, I think what's really going on is that it's just Rand doesn't understand any of this and who he is, and he's just kind of bumbling around. And I assume there will be some kind of catalyst to come, which finally kind of doesn't erase all these, but kind of arrays them, sets them into a clear matrix, and he knows his identity.
And I think that idea that Rand kind of doesn't know who he is, and as you said, is kind of bumbling into it, I think really comes into play in the last scene that we see with Rand and Selene and Loyal as they are kind of inspecting the horn. It feels like every time Rand makes a decision about what to do, he's contradicted by Selene and immediately jumps onto her side. And I think that highlights exactly what you're describing, right? If you don't know who you are and what you stand for and what you're doing, it's very easy to be talked out of things because you don't have any attachment to them. And so this, I think you're setting up the question of who Rand is and where he's going exactly right. Right now, it kind of feels like he's been broken down in a lot of ways, where a lot of the things that defined him, he's being told are less important, and things he didn't know about himself are coming to the fore. And now on top of that, we have someone who's clearly manipulating him. It's not a great place to be in. I'll be real. I don't have much else to say here, but I think this really highlights the place where that Rand is in terms of his development as a character. Do you have any thoughts on this last sequence? To me, it just feels like more of Selene being sus, but you may have pulled something else out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you just said is where I am. Just the fact that the end result seems to be to go to her home. It's like, oh, okay, this is where she's more powerful, probably, or at least more in control of what's going on. And it does seem like Rand would normally just want to get that dagger to Matt as fast as possible. I think maybe I'll just add this last thought, is that the dagger still feels like a wild card in this. Like you said in your summary, he forgets he's holding it. It's like, oh yeah, I shouldn't do this. They hide it in the box. But in terms of everything is unfolding in terms of a pattern, that still feels like the thing that's not supposed to be in the mix here. And so I kind of keep my eyes on it, and the choices. Liked the plan of putting it in the box, but then it's like, well, wait, is this some kind of magic box? Is this going to amplify its power or something? It seemed like a good decision, but a rash decision.
Yeah, I remember being like 10 or 11 reading this book for the first time and being deathly afraid that the dagger was going to infect the horn somehow. I am not even going to rule out the possibility of that taking place, but that was my initial impression, was fear of that.
Huh.
Another thing that I wanted to point out, since I think we are both at this point suspicious enough of Selene that one more hint is not necessarily going to tip anything, I will point out, you mentioned that Rand kind of forgets that he has been holding the dagger. Quick note, Selene immediately warns him not to cut himself on that dagger before anyone mentions that it is a magical dagger. So she seems to know some things that maybe she shouldn't. Other than that, we get like a 3-paragraph Fane POV that leaves me mostly asking you, what do you make of him saying he is a dog no longer and the world will pay? That was my only question coming out of that POV.
I mean, I take that to mean because his powers have somehow weakened, right? That he's, It makes me think he was not in control of his actions anymore, right? A dog is not in control. Well, now I'm getting lost in the double negatives.
Yeah.
So he was not in control, and that was a positive thing for him, right?
Yeah.
And like a dog is not under control. We think of a dog
Yeah.
as healing to a master,
Yep.
and that's what was going on. But now that he's lost that power, instead of being like we'd expect, which is, yay, I'm free, it's the world will pay. So I think controlling the dagger specifically made him more powerful in the rankings of the court of Baalzamon. And now he's lost that and will burn the world down before somebody else gets to replace him at the side of Baalzamon.
Next time through the glass. No, I'm kidding. I think that is absolutely right. I think I don't get much out of this Fane POV other than to tell us he knows where Rand is and he's coming. And that's information that it's valuable we have. But I think we've mentioned this before. I am a big believer in like the 90 to 100-minute movie, and anything you can do to cut down to that should happen. This is a scene that would need to be cut in any Marvel movie, right? They'd want to put it in. They need it to cover the plot holes, but no, just cut it. I don't need scenes like this.
Yeah. So then the last thing is, in my introduction, I promised you'd tell us beneath the dagger, what kind of dagger. To me, that is the dagger mountain. It is the dagger that's resting on top of the horn.
Yep.
And I would say it's the dagger that is now weighing down on our hero in the party and is becoming a burden. How'd I do?
Very well. I think there are no
right.
other daggers that you have missed, unless there are 8 other daggers that you have missed. Please email us for all of the missing daggers. Next week, we are going to be covering 2 more chapters. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, these are the last 2 chapters that I'm going to be grumbling about at the beginning of the episode. They are Chapter 20, Sidene, and Chapter 21, The 9 Rings. Any last thoughts or things that you are anticipating before we head off into the next week of our lives, Greg?
Off we go. As I said, this week does not get us to halfway, but I believe the week after does. So we're closing in on it. And I'm excited to see it pick up in pace as you've been teasing us. So we will get to that and so much more, because this train ain't stopping. Next time, Through the Glass Columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.